Battle of Mine Creek was the culmination of the last really serious rebel counteroffensive of the American Civil War. This operation, known as the Missouri Incursion, was an attempt by the floundering Confederacy to open a new front in the trans-Mississippi area. The stated objective was to persuade Missouri to secede from the Union. More realistically, the rebels hoped to disrupt federal operations by forcing them to redirect troops from Sherman's Army of the Cumberland, which at the time was driving into Georgia. The prime mover for the Missouri Incursion was Major General Sterling Price. A major political figure in Missouri before the war, he had graduated into the de facto leader of the extensive pro-Southern elements there. He had been urging a Confederate drive into the state for some time, but his superiors distrusted both his ambition and his military skill. However, with the overall military situation rapidly deteriorating, and reports indicating that the Union forces garrisoning Missouri had been much depleted, in August of 1864 the Confederate government finally authorised the invasion. The huge distances involved in the trans-Mississippi area dictated an operation largely conducted by mounted units. There were only a few regular Confederate cavalry units available, and with the Mississippi now controlled by the Federals following the fall of Vicksburg, little hope of getting any more. Price was undeterred. He conducted a massive recruitment drive throughout Arkansas, making full use of Confederate conscription legislation, and managed to scrape together a very impressive strike force of some 12,000. Unfortunately, its quality left a lot to be desired. The new recruits were lukewarm in their allegiance to the obviously failing Confederate cause, and equipment was very scarce. A fair proportion of Price's new soldiers were without horses, and at least a quarter of them were unarmed. Nonetheless, at first all went well. Missouri had indeed been denuded of Federal troops, and Price was able to sweep into the southern part of the state, striking heavy blows on all sides. Isolated Union garrisons were overwhelmed, much needed supplies were captured, and a great deal of Federal property was destroyed, particularly railroad lines and bridges. Rebel sympathisers were recruited into Price's army, although not in the numbers that had been hoped for, and even more Missourians took oaths of neutrality. Then things started to go wrong. An attack upon a small Union fort at Pilot Knob was badly bungled, leading to heavy casualties. The Confederate movement slowed, partly because so many foraging expeditions were being sent out, and partly because of an over-reliance on a huge wagon train. The Federals were given time to concentrate the state militia, and masses of other blue-clad troops poured into Missouri. These superior numbers forced Price away from his main objective, the state capital at Kansas City. He was then defeated in a sprawling 3-day engagement at Westport, sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West. It was now clear that nothing more could be achieved by Price's incursion, and that to remain in Missouri was to court complete destruction. Price's objective became nothing more than getting as much of his weary army as possible back to friendly territory. The Federals pursued closely, and constant skirmishing marked the passage of the Confederate force as it retreated southwards. In general, the rebels were able to avoid becoming entangled, but on October the 24th, 1864, they were finally caught up with at a tributary of the Osage River called Mine Creek. The problem was the large and stately Confederate supply train. The banks of Mine Creek were very steep, and the wagons both heavy and numerous. The area was soon churned into thick, clinging mud, slowing the passage of the wagons. The Confederate rearguard, under General Marmaduke, had caught up with the floundering train, and a pursuing Federal cavalry division was barely 500 yards behind them. Marmaduke realised that the train was going to be overrun unless the pursuing Union force could be delayed. He hurriedly formed a rudimentary defence line and called for reinforcements. Information on the exact size and even nomenclature of the units in the rebel army is scanty. Many of the Confederate records were lost or destroyed, and so it is impossible to give an exact order of battle, especially as rebel units at this stage of the war were frequently reorganised, amalgamated and or renamed. The rearguard primarily consisted of Marmaduke's own division, which was comprised of two small cavalry brigades under Generals Clark and Freeman. Clark's brigade was the more experienced of the two. Clark reported at the start of the campaign that his brigade was about 1,200 strong and that it was in fair condition. They had been very active in the initial sweep through northern Arkansas and southern Missouri, detachments being sent off regularly to overwhelm isolated Union garrisons and loot supply depots. The brigade took about 100 casualties at Pilot Knob, an even bigger drubbing at Westport, and they don't seem to have received many of the new recruits who joined during the campaign. Freeman's brigade was mostly made up of new recruits from Arkansas. Most of them started the campaign unarmed, although they must have received a proportion of the small arms captured early in the campaign, and certainly a large number of the few Missourians who joined the army were assigned to them. The brigade was repulsed with some loss attacking Pilot Knob and pushed back and scattered at Westport. Both formations were probably down to about 800 to 900 men. The reinforcements Marmaduke called for came from Fagan's division, which consisted of 4 brigades. Cable's brigade was very much the hardcore of the army at the start of the campaign, some 2,800 veteran troopers, well mounted and armed. Unfortunately, they had been badly mauled by the time of Mine Creek. They took heavy casualties at Pilot Knob and especially at Westport, where some 300 had been captured. They were probably down to not much more than 2,000 men. Slemmon's and Doblin's brigades were both made up entirely of Arkansas recruits, all of them inexperienced and poorly armed. On the plus side, they hadn't seen much of the early fighting and therefore hadn't suffered many battle casualties. They probably came to about 1,000 plus troopers each. Fagan's division included several unattached regiments as well, but there is little evidence that any of them were present at Mine Creek. The 4th Brigade of the division, McCrae's, was definitely absent. Both divisions had an attached artillery battery, each armed with 4 light smoothbore cannon, probably 6-pounders. They seemed to have been reasonably well handled. The entire Confederate force was therefore somewhat over 6,000 strong. The pursuing Federal force was Pleasanton's cavalry division. It consisted of 4 brigades under Generals Brown, Winslow, Sanborn and McNeil, although only the first 2 were present at this battle, totalling about 2,500 troopers. They were thus heavily outnumbered, but under orders to press the pursuit as hard as possible. General Alfred Pleasonton had been the cavalry commander of the Army of the Potomac, but had not been a success. Consistently outmanoeuvred by the Confederate cavalry under J.E.B. Jeb Stuart, he had blamed everyone but himself and was consequently deeply unpopular. Growing exasperated with his continual failures and excuses, the Union High Command had relegated him to the relative backwater of Missouri, where his acerbic temper was still in evidence. At the recent Battle of Westport, he had decided that one of his brigade commanders, Brown, was not moving quickly enough, and had fired him on the spot. It was this very brigade, now under the temporary command of Lieutenant Colonel Phillips of the 7th Missouri Militia, which was leading the advance. On the right, Winslow's brigade was also missing its commander. Winslow had suffered a troublesome wound at the Battle of Westport and had finally been persuaded to rest. Temporary command had been given to Lieutenant Colonel Benteen, the same Benteen who was later to serve under General Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Both brigades consisted of 3 cavalry regiments, the 1st, 4th and 7th Missouri Militia Cavalry in Phillips' command, and the 10th Missouri Militia Cavalry, together with the 3rd and 4th Iowa Cavalry, in Benteen's command. Each brigade had an attached horse artillery battery of 6 3-inch ordnance rifled cannon. The militia tag on 4 of these regiments is misleading. They were all regular troops, well mounted and very well armed, mostly with repeating rifles. This gave them a considerable firepower advantage over the rebel troopers, who were mostly armed with single-shot weapons, if they were armed at all. The Missouri militia spent most of the war fighting Confederate bushwhackers and guerrillas, and they were tough and seasoned soldiers, although they had little experience of open field battles. The Battle of Mine Creek was fought over a completely open and flat piece of prairie. The only significant terrain feature was the creek, over which the Confederate wagons were laboriously moving. Mine Creek was not particularly wide, deep or fast flowing, and so was fordable just about anywhere. However, as has been said, the banks were very steep, and after the passage of thousands of Confederate troopers rushing back to the rearguard, completely churned into mud. It presented a formidable obstacle at the back of the Confederate lines. Marmaduke had hurriedly formed his tired and dispirited troops into some kind of defensive front, but there had been no time to properly deploy them. As a result, units were badly mixed up, and as there had been no time to send the horses to the rear, many of the troopers were still mounted. Morale was low. Continued defeat and retreat had sapped the spirit of all the troops, even the most dedicated of secessionists. The general consensus amongst the men was that a massive federal force was bearing down with them, and though in fact it was the Union cavalry who were heavily outnumbered. Philip's brigade arrived first, and as was customary, dismounted to begin a long-range musketry duel with Cable's brigade directly ahead of them. Phillips briefly entertained the idea of attacking, but the arrival of Benteen's brigade in support on his right flank dissuaded him. Phillips halted his brigade until Benteen's troopers had drawn level, so that the two could advance together. Benteen, however, had noticed how disordered the Confederates opposite him were. In particular, their artillery pieces had been placed ahead of the line, which meant they would be able to fire no more than once or twice before an attacking force was upon them. Benteen therefore ordered his brigade to remain mounted and to make a charge. This was a very bold move. Mounted troops had dominated battles in the Middle Ages, but the steadily increasing firepower of infantry weapons, starting with the longbow, then the arquebus, the smoothbore musket, and now the rifle musket, had made the shock attack of heavy cavalry increasingly obsolete. By the time of the American Civil War, the proportion of cavalry in armies had fallen to less than 10%, and they mostly fought as dragoons, effectively mounted infantry. Unfortunately, Benteen's men were also very aware of the vulnerability of mounted men to infantry fire. His lead regiment, the 10th Missouri Militia, received heavy fire as it moved up, and its attacks stalled. A rebel countercharge at this point might have been decisive, but disorganised as they were, and just as influenced by the new reality of infantry firepower, they also took to long-range skirmishing. The impasse was broken by the 4th Iowa Cavalry, which bypassed the 10th Missouri and charged into the surprised rebels opposite them. The rest of the Union troops took heart and charged after the 4th Iowa. Benteen's brigade arrowed into the centre of Marmaduke's brigade on the Confederate left. Freeman's inexperienced brigade fell back even before the Union troopers made contact. Clark's brigade took the brunt of the assault. There was a brief melee, but the Confederate line was soon pierced. With Marmaduke's division now in full retreat, Cable's brigade was exposed on its left flank, and it too was forced to fall back. Phillips' brigade struck the rest of Fagan's division and routed them. The rebels panicked and fled, many discarding their weapons, and were ridden down or caught in the muddy quagmire of the creek, by now barely crossable. The Confederate wagon train had actually managed to get over the creek, but was still very exposed. Phillips and Benteen pressed the pursuit. Fagan attempted to reform his division into a new defensive line, but failed. Price was forced to hurriedly deploy more brigades to protect the wagons. Fortunately for the rebels, the furious charge had blown the horses of the Union cavalry, and they too had become disordered. The battle slowly petered out, although skirmishing continued for some hours, until night finally brought the fighting to an end. Mine Creek was one of the biggest cavalry engagements of the war, and it certainly featured by far the most successful mounted charge. It was also one of the shortest battles. The actual main clash lasted a bare 30 minutes. The result was an unmitigated disaster for the Confederates. About 100 were killed, and at least 10 times the number taken prisoner, including Generals Marmaduke, Cable, and Slemons. All 8 Confederate cannon were also captured, along with thousands of valuable small arms discarded in the rout. In contrast, Union casualties were extremely light, less than 75. Having remained brutally aware of just how vulnerable the wagon train was, Price gave orders for half of it to be destroyed that night. Thus unencumbered, the rebels were able to withdraw rapidly at dawn, covering an astonishing 56 miles in a single day. Price was therefore able to disengage successfully, but his army was a shattered and demoralised shadow of the force upon which so many hopes had been laid the previous month. Desertion was particularly heavy during the retreat in Arkansas. Apart from some desultory raids and skirmishes, there was little further activity in Arkansas and indeed the whole Trans-Mississippi region for the rest of the war. Union forces saw little to be gained by attacking the area. The focus shifted eastwards to the great sweep by the Union armies into the heartland of the South.